Hello, and welcome to the podcast of Kobols Gleaming, Part 2. Ronald D, executive producer and creator of the new Battlestar Galactica. I just finished a few moments ago doing the podcast for Part 1, so a lot of this is a continuation, as is the episode of Part 1. And once again, I would just caution all of you, if you have not watched this episode, I would suggest you do that before you listen to the podcast, because I'll be talking about things at the end. And I don't want to spoil it for all of you. As I was saying before, a key structural change that happened was shifting the end of the show. Primarily, we moved the original Night One out was the crash of the Raptor. And now the Night One out is Kara taking the Raider and jumping back to Caprica, which I think is a much stronger, more emotional, more personal beat. And as a result of that basic decision, it allowed Part 2 to open up a bit. It allowed us to play all the moments in Part 2, because I think one of the key things about the show is its ability to play the moments. You're not just rushing through things. You're not just like brushing over details and not giving the scenes themselves, a chance to breathe and to really enjoy the characters and to play texture and detail. And it's as simple as an example in 33. There's a shot where Adama's shaving in the bathroom, and camera just jumps down to watch him, rinse the shaving cream off of his razor, and watching them eat noodles. I mean, just all the sort of little details about life and how the people interact, and being able to play moments like this in their full glory, to really give it its due and give enough space and not rush through the whole thing. You have to have enough room to do that, and one of the challenges of the show is to do these stories in an efficient way, because you've only got 40 minutes to tell an hour story. I hate to tell you, but it's only 40 minutes of actual program content time. And so sometimes it's really hard to cram all that material in there. And Michael's decision, or Danny's decision to shift the night break opened up Night 2 and made Night 2 play in a much more comfortable fashion. That little bit of business there, when James is reaching through the flame, he's really reaching through the flame. It's not a CGI, it's not digital, none of this is really, except for this shot coming up there. It's all practical. So when you saw him reach out and put his hands in the flame, it's just James being crazy and putting his arms in the middle of raging fires on the set. And it's always interesting to sort of see what the actors will and will not do. I mean, most of the time my experience is that actors want to do their own stunts and desire to do their own stunts, and will go way out of their way to train themselves and learn the techniques and work with the stunt people, and generally want to do their own stunts. And rare is and they did happen. There were a couple actors who I won't name that I worked with at Star Trek who just did not like to do stunts. And if the character was going to fall down, it was like, stunt man, but that was sort of the exception rather than the rule. This whole little ending was the tease of Night 2. It just had the actual crash. It took them all the way. It was like the tease. No, I take that back. The teaser went out on the Raptor going, hitting, crashing, and then I think Act 1 began with the sequence that you just saw. A couple of things just to remind you, some things I said on the Night One podcast, which was that there was a whole separate storyline going on down at Kobol that we dispensed with, which had to do with the two temples. There was a temple on Kobol and another temple that had built on Caprica to sort of emulate the original. And one of the reasons why we got rid of that was strictly production. Balancing the budget versus the creative needs of the show is one of the biggest challenges of producing this series. And you always write to what the best version of the show, and then you pare back. And there was just no way that we could get the temple. I'll come back in a second. There was really no way to get the temple on Caprica and the temple on Kobol to work. They were too expensive. We could not believably make create temples practically on the stage, and then we were going to CGI, do digital extensions of both sets to sort of make it, to sell it in both locations. And it just became cost prohibitive. And likewise, the surrounding of the temple, and the big firefight that we were going to do with a lot of Centurions and hovercraft and raiders and all that, laying siege, or about to lay siege to the temple on Kobol, was another element that we just could not afford. So, compromises have to be made, and you're forced to think in other directions. And so this notion of the arrow being not in a temple on Caprica, but actually being in a museum, also seemed a little bit more real, more believable. It felt more real for a society that is, has a religious aspect to it. A lot of people take the religion seriously and are practicing a faith, but then there's a large secular community that, probably either doesn't believe or believes, in a very low boil way, that by and large a lot of quote-unquote religious items and artifacts would have worked their way and found their way into museums. So that became a much easier sort of justification for the museum on Caprica. And as far as the story on Kobol, that went through several iterations and many changes, and from going from 2 ground survey teams to just consolidating it into one, and also the decision not to put Lee down there. I mean, where was Lee's role in this drama was something that took a lot of wrangling. If Lee is down on the planet's surface, it required a different kind of story down there. He's in charge. It's his command. It's his mission. It's all about Lee. And sort of we were talking about some conflict between him and Tyrrell, him and his crew chief, and Tyrrell questioning him in some ways, and Lee's leadership and growth. And ultimately, it wasn't quite as satisfying that he wasn't back aboard Galactica when his father is shot and when the president is deposed from power. It seemed like he should be back here and dealing with this story, and by making that sort of key change, it allowed the the Kobold story to take on a different complexion. And as you'll see, Crash Down is in charge down on the surface of Kobold, but he may not be the best man, the best leader for that situation, and doubt starts to creep in about whose command they're under, and what will Tyrrell do. You couldn't play that really if it was Lee, because he's just a more capable, more competent leader, and he's expected to fill that role every week. But by making a Crash Down, it becomes a legitimate, okay, wait a minute, who's in charge here kind of a thing. And it also meant that if Lee is aboard if he's aboard, Galactica and Colonial One on this storyline, when they try to take down the president, it forces him to have to make a choice, and it meant that he could have to pick Laura over his father, and that he would go down for that, and he would be in jail, and that he would be there in the room, literally in handcuffs when the final moments of the episode went down, which I thought was much stronger. And moving forward, it meant that Lee is with us aboard Galactica in this world at the beginning of season 2, as opposed to being somewhere else that he has to be rescued and on a completely different story and having no idea what's even happening to his father, which didn't seem as satisfying. This sort of this storyline of Galactica starting to move toward deposing the president and staging a military coup is something that had been on the drawing board from the beginning. My initial story proposals for the first season, as contained in the Bible and in some other documents I wrote for the network, I always saw initially that the arc of the two characters of Laura and Adama was going to be, okay, you think at first she's the dove and he's the hawk, but in truth she's capable of far tougher things than he's capable of, and he's much more sort of civil libertarian minded, for lack of a better phrase, than she is. That each of them has elements of both hawk and dove, and that they're driven by character things, not that they're not just archetypes that you push around. He's not always going to do the military thing, she's not always going to do the soft and touchy-feeling thing. And that the arc for the season initially was that Laura was going to go too far. Laura was going to get caught up in the need to maintain security in a in a situation such as this, and that would force her to crack down harder and harder on dissent, and she would, winnow away from basic freedoms one by one. Adama was going to be essentially the one tasked to carry out those orders. He was going to become more and more and more uncomfortable with it as the season went on, and ultimately she would go too far, and he would step in, and he would institute a coup, and that by the end of season 1, she was going to be in jail, and he would have taken over, as the military commander and declared martial law, which is exactly what neither of them wanted at the beginning. That's still where we kind of end up. I mean, the journey along the way changed. Laura didn't really crack down so much as she did was show teeth, show an ability to be pragmatic, show a willingness to cut, to stab her friend in the back, to shove an assailant out an airlock. You started to realize that she's capable of taking strong measures, but we didn't have to paint her quite so starkly as I was thinking initially as, being a badass and really kind of, going after people. It also didn't fit with Mary's portrayal of Laura. So what did happen is you start to see that she's perfectly capable of doing what she thinks needs to be done. If she thinks she's right, she's going to do it. And the fundamental agreement of the civilian and the military leadership in the fleet seemed like the right place to play the conflict. That essentially, if she breaks the vow she made in the miniseries, the vow to let him have control over military decisions, that would be the point where he would step in. You don't break your word to Adama. You just don't. And she did. And his reaction to that is resolute and with a bit of sadness. I don't think he definitely doesn't want it. He doesn't want the command of the fleet. He doesn't want to have to deal with the civilians. He doesn't want to do any of these things. But she broke her word to him. She got Kara Thrace of all people to turn against him and take a military asset away from the Galactica at the very moment that they were working on a plan to attack a silent. I mean, there's just so many reasons he had to do it. He has to act against her, and she knows full well that he's going to do that. I mean, that is also part of the story. Is that when she made that decision, it was with her eyes wide open. She knew what it was going to mean. And that he was coming for her, which is the reason why she had the press on board. She wanted to be public. She wanted people to know what was really at stake. Now we're flying over the devastated city of Delphi. Again, here you can see there was a cataclysm. The place wasn't leveled, but clearly there was damage. There were blast waves hit the city, radiation. This is a world that has been attacked with nuclear weapons, and the question is, why did they leave any of it standing? And that's a question I think we'll start to answer into the second season. This is, of course, the entire Caprica storyline in season 1, builds to this idea and to this moment. That Sharon is pregnant by Hilo, and that's an important thing to the Silence. And why is that an important thing to the Silence? Well, you'll have to stay tuned, and we'll talk about that in more detail in the second season. But yes, the entire storyline, all the things that have happened on Caprica, were done and manipulated for a reason, and that reason was to see if Sharon could become impregnated with Hilo's child. And why is that so important to the Silence? Why would they concoct this elaborate scheme to maneuver those two into that kind of situation? And that's a question that we'll answer next season, as it were. Now, this is where, you can see that we're starting to ramp up the tension. You're starting to intercut between a lot of events. A lot of storylines are starting to come together, and it's hard. You can't really say which one is the A story, which one is the B story at this point. I suppose you could argue that this is the A story, that, his taking down the president is the primary chord, but we've also got Sharon heading off to the base star simultaneously. It's like a lot of things are starting to happen. And what I think is interesting is that the show, again, does not talk down to the audience. The audience, the show is willing to throw challenging material at you with a lot of characters and a lot of different storylines, and trust that you're smart enough to follow. To trust that you're going to be engaged in all these issues and all these ideas and characters and know what's going on in each scene without me having to write, loathsome lines of exposition that will do nothing more than kind of reiterate points that you should already know intuitively. I guess one of the things I've learned in television over the years is that the audience understands things much quicker and easier than we typically give them credit for. I think part of that is because, in a way, everyone certainly in this country, is sort of born with the 3-act structure in their head. I mean, by the time you're a thinking adult, you have watched or listened to or read, and probably all of the above, a tremendous amount of narrative. You understand the 3-act structure, beginning, middle, and end. And it has been told to you from, Elmo to Huckleberry Finn to Battlestar Galactica. And audiences have an idea how narrative works. They're able to follow these beats without a tremendous amount of elaboration. And I think that oftentimes television makes a mistake in that it thinks that the audience is either stupid or not paying attention, and the audience will just be too easily confused and they won't follow along. And I just firmly believe that the audience, if anything, is usually ahead of you. The audience knows sort of the rhythms and structure of an episode of television. They kind of know that if your they just know if your main character is in jeopardy at the end of Act 2, well, we got 2 more acts. There's a half hour into the show. You know he's not dying yet. And so you can only sort of push those kinds of buttons so far without insulting their intelligence. And likewise, the audience knows enough to follow all these details. They remember why Kara's there. They know what she's doing on the planet. They get why she would need radiation. It's like you don't have to really script in a tremendous amount of dialogue to explain, okay, here I am. I'm Kara Thrace. I'm walking into the museum. What am I looking for? I'm looking for the Arrow of Apollo, which is all material that has been said previously in the episode and in other scenes, and all you have to do is follow along and pay attention, and you'll enjoy the episode. The question of what we would see on the inside of the Cylon base star took a lot of discussion. It's the first time we're really going to go inside a Cylon place, because I don't think the Raider really counts, but we've never really been in the Cylon world up until this episode, so there was a lot of discussion about what that would be. I think in my initial drafts I was an advocate of the idea of it should just be a white room. Just don't show anything. Go in, it's a white room. We blow it out, there's a lot of lens flare and a lot of heavy on the heavenly light kind of scheme. And not see anything, because I was worried that whatever you see was always going to be more disappointing than what you had hoped to see in your mind. And then the idea that Michael Reimer and Richard Hudol, the production designer, came up with, which was to continue the language of the biomechanical world into the Cylon base star. And that's ultimately what we went with. Here on Kobol, there's Socinus. A side note about Socinus, for those of you following along. Socinus was the character who went to jail in Litmus because he lied on the stand and took a fall trying to protect Tyrrell. There was a scene in this episode which was shot, and it might even be in the deleted scenes on the website, of Tyrrell getting him out of jail, frankly. And it was basically they were running a test on the Cylon Raider on this AIC, and the Raider jumps, and it works, and it's like, hooray, we've figured out how to make the jump work. And Adama turns to Tyrrell and says, congratulations, Chief. And the Chief says, well, the real credit should go to Lieutenant Starbuck. And Adama says, I know who does the real work on this ship. Congratulations, Chief. And the Chief says, thank you. And then he takes a pause, and he says, well, speaking of someone who does real work and the need for people who do real work on the ship, and Adama looks at him, knows what he's talking about, and he says, okay, go with God, or whatever he says. I can't remember how he got out. He just sort of nods and says, okay. And then you cut straight to the brig, and Tyrrell has gotten Socinus out of the brig so that he could go on this ground mission. And it was a nice scene, and Socinus comes out, and he says, oh, thanks for getting me out. And the Chief busts busts his balls right there. It's like, you were stupid. You were in there because you were stupid. It was a dumb thing to do, and you're getting out so you can work because I need somebody to work. And really sort of took it to him a little bit. And it was great, and it was really, really painful to have to cut that scene and edit it because we all loved it. It set it up. It was a nice character moment, but some things just had to go. We just did not have another chunk. It was like a 2-3 minutes that we were able to cut out of the episode by losing both those little scenes, and we didn't have anything else to trade for it, so they had to go and end up on the cutting room floor. And hopefully you can see them on the website or in the eventual magnificent DVD release, which will include every scrap of footage ever shot on Battlestar Galactica. One would hope. It'll be a 55 DVD set that you can buy and will weigh 25 pounds. Merchandising and licensing is panicking even as I say that. So again, here we are. We're going to the Cylon base ship for the first time. Racetrack in the background is somebody that we will also be using next season. We were very happy with the actress, happy with the character. This was like that little bit of going into the Cylon base story and subsequent shots of it. Gary Hutzel and the visual effects team were very excited about it. A lot of long discussions with them about what it was going to be, and it was really an opportunity to do a lot of really cool visual effects stuff. Here on Kobol, as I said earlier, there was originally the two temples. There was a temple on Kobol, the temple on Caprica, and the temple on Kobol storyline always had Baltar going into the temple and discovering something huge and amazing, and sort of ending the season on a revelation. In the first draft of Kobol's Last Gleaming, he went into the temple, and Six took him towards some subterranean passage. It was very dark, and she said, "This is as far as I can go." And he says, "What?" And she makes him go further, and he just kind of finds himself walking in a void, a black void, and doesn't know where it's leading. And at the end of that, he comes into a room, and he hears music, and it's a recognizable Earth tune to the audience and to him. It was Jimi Hendrix was playing, actually. And he goes, "God, I recognize that." And then a voice says, "You recognize that?" And he says, "Yes." And he turns, and it's Dirk Benedict. and Dirk Benedict said, "Hi, I'm God." And we just cut out on that. Just to continue, I thought about Kobol, and it was Dirk Benedict, and he said, "Hi, I'm God." And they shake hands, and we were going to cut, and that was going to be the end of that whole storyline at the episode. I liked it. I thought it was wacky. I didn't quite know what it meant. I thought I was looking for a surprise, something sort of interesting that fed into the mythos of the show and also to the audience, and something that would be really unexpected and different. And frankly, I didn't know what the hell it meant. I didn't know, is he lying? Is it true? It threw a lot of puzzle pieces up in the air in an unexpected way, which, to me was a reason to try to do it and see if it worked. And by and large, the reaction sort of ran the gamut from, huh? To, that's really wild and cool. And ultimately, in a discussion with the network, I think it was Mark Stern, who's our production executive at the network, just said, "You know what, you don't need this. You really don't need to go this far. It seems like you're pushing. It's pushing too far. It's winking at the audience for the first time, and you haven't done that." And I said, "You know what, you're right." He was right. It was a misstep, but you have to sort of be willing to take chances on the page, because that's where you'd want to take your chances. You want to risk things and do the unexpected moment on the page and see if it works. And in this case, it was an idea that didn't work, so I just dumped it. Then it became a question about, okay, what do you see on in the interior of the temple? When we were still talking about a temple, and that went through a few iterations, which I'll come back to in a minute. This is now the museum on Caprica. Kara going after the arrow. There was always going to be an arrow of Apollo. Oh, we are back at Kobol. I'm lost in my own editing. Might as well continue with the Kobol story. There was always going to be a temple. It was always a question of what he's going to find on the inside of it. And once we got rid of the temple, we went for this idea of ruins. And I liked it that they were true ruins. They weren't like a big, elaborate, giant Roman kind of thing. They were just these simple ruins that Baltar and Six were walking through. And in earlier drafts, there was an idea that was sparked by Michael Reimer about going into the ruin and finding yourself in another space. and that the other space would turn out. It's really hard to talk about the Opera House when Six and Starbuck are beating the crap out of each other and shooting at each other. This was, I think, David Icke's idea way back when he mid-season, we first started talking about the finale. He was very excited about the idea of seeing Starbuck and Six really go at it, really do a fight between the two of them, and no holds barred, and that stayed through all the drafts. That Six and Starbuck are going to fight at some point. Here again, you're seeing the interior of the base star is conceived by Gary Hutzel and the visual effects team. None of this is model animation. This is all just CGI computer animation, giving you a real sense of the interior, and which I think is just really, really great. And the way it marries into the live action footage later on is really cool too. This is all very expensive stuff. This is another reason why these 2 episodes were way over our normal pattern budget. We had to save our pennies in previous episodes to afford this episode, and then we also got the network and the studio to cut us some slack and give us some extra money just to do the finale. And in large part because they were so excited by the finale and the story, and they wanted to see it as well. And they wanted to end season 1 with a bang, end it with something really spectacular and exciting for the audience. And then let's go out into the silent base ship. Now we're on the set. From this point forward, now you're on the actual set with our Raptor. There was a lot of sort of tricky logistics about where to Sharon stand so that Racetrack can see her moving around but doesn't see all the Sharons that are coming up. So that was all difficult, and this is a lot of very complicated lighting. Richard and his team and the production design, and trying to come up with something that would be visually interesting and that you hadn't seen before, and sort of going through this sort of this sort of organic / synthetic interior to the base star that was reminiscent of, but not exactly the same as what we saw in the interior of the Raider that Kara took. And this is the first time, I believe, that we've actually seen weaponry, mounted on the exterior of the Raptors, at least on the practical set. Now back to Caprica. I believe this is an actual museum. I can't really remember. I think we set decked this to an extent, but I think that this is an actual museum someplace. And now I'm totally wrong. I don't even remember now, because now you shift from a museum location into this sort of more rubble-strewn place, which is some kind of building site or something that we were using. Watching these 2 fight is really interesting. This is really them. This is really them doing their own thing. And Trish is somebody who, before the series, never threw a punch. I don't think Trish had any training in fights or martial arts or anything like that. And she went into training specifically because we started to call for scenes where her character would have to first beat up Sharon and then do things like this. And she took it very seriously and really developed a style of fighting which feels very believable on camera. And that is tricky. It's not as easy as it sounds. I mean, how many times have you watched film or TV and you just don't believe that the characters are really fighting, or it looks phony or staged, or they're not? Here on Colonial One, the confrontation between the Marines and Laura's security detail, there used to be other scenes and other pieces of business that told you that the security detail had been handpicked by Lee from civilians in the fleet, and it was responsible to Laura and answered only to Laura. So her security detail has no allegiance to the Galactica personnel. They were like former cops and security people and people with some kind of firearms training and some kind of background and something like that. But that the Secret Service, as it were, protecting Colonial One, was a distinct entity from the Marines and from the deckhands and the people aboard Galactica, and that had been something that Lee himself had intentionally designed for her. Not really because he thought that this day would come, but just because he thought it should be a separate command structure, that he didn't want to confuse the 2 lines of authority and who responded to who and who was under whose control. This whole sequence was very complicated, very difficult to shoot. Took a lot of work on the part of everybody to bring it forward. So this is all, you can see the cameras moving. This is motion control work, which is time-consuming and complex. Sharon is or not Sharon, Grace is playing all of these people. It's all Grace walking into camera with very carefully done shadows, so you don't see the naughty parts. And you have to shoot this over and over again, and you have to shoot from every, she walks in on the left, she walks in on the right, she walks in the middle, there's a lot of walking, she has to hit the mark in rhythm, she has to do the dialogue in rhythm, they have to constantly look at the monitors and playback, and doing a sequence like that is extraordinarily complex, which is why, one of the reasons why you don't see us doing lots of scenes with, 5 6s all together, or 5 Durals all together. They're fun and interesting, but they're a bear to shoot, and, so you end up only doing them when you really, really are getting the most bang for your buck, not to just, do it for the fun of it, because the CG, the visual effects itself, just doing the motion control and matting them all in and comping them in correctly and getting the perspectives right, the shadows, that's expensive. And then the production time it takes to actually shoot it on the set is also expensive, because time is money on a soundstage, and it's all about, how long will it take us to shoot this? And, you find yourself constantly sort of juggling those sort of requirements, the budget and the time it would require to shoot a sequence. That's a really hard fall. That looks like it really, really hurt. Starbuck? And I'll come back in a moment. This standoff, in the original draft, we did not get to this point exactly. When Lee was down on the planet, and we had a somewhat different structure, the standoff was going to be Laura on the inside of her office, the Marines on the outside. They're about to burst through the door, and it was at that moment that Adama was shot. So you were going to leave season 1 with Laura about to be taken down, by the Marines, and Adama lying bleeding in CIC, and what will Ty do? That was kind of the thing. The immediate question, what will he do about Laura? What does he do about Adama? Decided not to do that, wanted to play it through, wanted to get her all the way, put her in jail, have Adama close the door on her, and wanted to play this beat with Lee. Wanted to see Lee, push comes to shove, Lee has to make a choice here. Will he, subvert the democracy? Will he participate in a military coup against the lawfully, designated president of the colonies, or will he make a stand? And Laura, who was willing a moment ago to go right up to the edge and see who's going to pull a trigger first and really make them do it, now it's entered a different zone. Now it's brother against brother, as it were. It's Galactica people turning against. You can see the whole thing starting to spiral wildly out of control, and it could be a true bloodbath at this point. And that's kind of where Laura has to step in and say, okay, the game of brinksmanship is over. Somebody has to blink first, and it's going to be me. But even in that moment, she's still clearly sort of in command. Let's go. Looking back on the first season, I guess I'm often asked in interviews these days, are you satisfied? Are you happy? Did the show turn out to be what you thought it would be? The show turned out to be a lot more than I thought it would be, frankly. I'm sort of humbled and surprised by how good the show became. And I think at the outset I was hoping this would be a really good series, and that I could really do something here that was interesting and different, and a show that I would be proud of and that people would respond to. I didn't anticipate how well received it was going to be critically, and how extraordinarily well it would do in the ratings, and just also how satisfying it is to me personally on a creative level and as a viewer. I just enjoy the show, and I'm really impressed by the people that work on the show with me, the cast and crew, which is just tremendous. And I think in large part the show has exceeded my expectations for what I was hoping we could do in its first season. And I think if there's any downside, it's that it's set the bar that much higher for the second season. Now, in my mind, the second season, I don't want to talk about topping yourself, because that becomes just sort of a silly game. Oh, well, we had one bomb in the first season, let's do 2 in the second. It's not about topping yourself. It's about continuing to progress the story and the characters and living up and fulfilling the promise of the first season. It's really about making it a worthy series, making it more than just those 13 episodes that were so great that first season. You want it to be, wow, the series as a whole really grew. It really became this fantastic piece of television. I think that's now the goal. The goal is now to make it really something special. I think it's off to a great start. I think it's made its mark. It's surprised a lot of people. It's exceeded the expectations of people who were tuning in to see Battlestar Galactica, frankly. And now we've passed through that threshold, and now it's about taking the next step. Now it's about really growing and challenging ourselves and challenging the audience and continuing to sort of provide surprises and twists just when you think you know this universe so well. This ending, as we careen here into the last moments, is I think some of the best stuff that we did all year. I know I keep saying that, but I think this episode really is some of the best work that we did all year. I think intercutting all these stories is remarkably effective. I mean, you're I'm hoping, and I think you are, I think you're really here with all these people. You're really on the hook about what's going to happen to Kara. What is she going to do when she finds out that Sharon's a Cylon? You know, what's going to happen to Tyrell and Crashdown, all those guys left down on the planet? And, you know, where's Baltar going? What did he do? Where is he? You know, what about Adama? What about Laura? Where's Lee? I just think the episode is almost over, and yet I think you have a hunger to know more. And you're like, if you're watching the clock when you're watching the episode, you're starting to panic. You're starting to go, wait a minute, what the hell's going to happen to all these people? Wait a minute, they're almost out of time. Is this an hour and a half episode? They can't wrap. They're not going to end this on a giant cliffhanger, are they? Are they? No, please say it's not so. This beat is really something that I think the director and Katie came up with, that, you know, not the shooting, which was scripted, but her emotional reaction and breakdown here. You know, it's like, on top of it all, on top of everything, and the fight, and the stealing the raider, and coming here and learning that one of her best friends is a Cylon, and now she's praying. It's just like, enough already, you know? Kara is only human. There is a breaking point. There is a point where it just becomes too much. Back to Kobol. Like I said, there was always a question of what Baltar's going to find when he went inside the temple, and then when he gets inside the ruins. And after, you know, the madness of Dirk Benedict subsided, Mike Reimer and I were talking. He brought in some location photos of a place he was really interested in. He didn't know what it meant, but there was this opera house in Vancouver that seemed visually really interesting. It was a different sort of visual language than what we had been using in the show. And it, you know, when you see the ruins, you expect something Roman and something Greek. And Michael's notion to use this more, if this feels more like, you know, Vienna in the 19th century than it does, you know, a Roman, you know, or a Greek temple. And it said something about the culture that was once here on Kobol, that it wasn't just all people running around in togas, that there was a society, that there was a civilization, that it really was a sophisticated place where the gods, whoever they were, and man lived as one, and had a certain elegance to them, which I thought was interesting. In the initial drafts, he came into this room, and there was an orchestra playing on the stage, and it was a recognizable piece, and he knew the piece, and there was dialogue with them walking down the aisle, much as they are now. And Baltar, it was all about him taking his place, and it was about the universe. You know, she talks about music here, and talks about, you know, the melody of life. And there was a point where the extension of the metaphor was him going up onto the stage, and there was an empty chair and a violin, and he didn't know how to play, but he sat down, he picked up the violin and joined in the orchestra, and you kind of went out with Baltar playing as a member of the orchestra. And an orchestra of what? And what did that symbolize? And what did it mean? What kind of thing had he transcended? And what did it mean to take his place as the orchestra in God's, you know, symphony or whatever it was? And that, you know, we talked about that at length, and there were lots of discussions with James and the director and myself, and no one ever got quite satisfied with it. And then we came to this. I believe it was Michael, and it might have even been James. I hesitate to say whose idea it was. This idea of the child, of the cradle, of, you know, them talking about, you know, Baltar being involved with the baby. And whose baby is it? Well, it's probably Sharon's baby, don't you think? And he's dealing with the Cylons, and that the Cylons have been trying to get Sharon pregnant all season, and that God has a plan for Baltar, and is Sharon coming back to Galactica? And it seemed an interesting, fascinating place to go, where you suddenly, all the plot, whoever made that suggestion was brilliant, because it suddenly made all the plot threads start to come together in a nice, clean line. Suddenly, all these disparate elements, you start to line up, and you start to feel that it all has sort of coherence, it all has resonance. It's not all random events happening for no reason. And that was something I always wanted. I always wanted a sense of, the sort of unified theory of Galactica, that these things are all relevant. And that they may not be apparent why they're relevant, and maybe you don't understand why they're relevant for quite a while, but they do. But they are. They do have meaning, and they do all sort of track in together. And then this sequence, which is, as we get here into the end, it was really important that Sharon not give anything away, that we not play any notion that she's about to do what she's about to do, that nobody be worried about it, that your dramatic focus is about the conflict between Lee and his father. So right away the audience is taken off guard, because you're focusing on that. You're focusing on the father's betrayal by the son wondering what's going to happen to him, and then him going over and congratulating Sharon is just a way of showing Lee, how wrong he was, that these guys did their job and carried out their orders even though they had questions. And it seems to be just servicing the emotional component of the scene, which is the father-son. And so you hide the card, as I'm always saying in swing meetings. Hide the card. Don't let the audience know what the scene's really about until, boom, she just does it. And does it more than once. And then begins all this fantastic intercut. You're knocking her down, Lee's trauma, Baltar's madness. It's great. It's a great ending. I'm very proud of this ending. This is a really, really good cliffhanger. This is the way you want to end the season. This is, this brings it all home. You're hooked. I'm hooked. I wrote the damn thing, and I'm hooked. I want to see what happens next. I want to know what's going to happen in that room. All these characters, will he live? Will he die? What about Sharon? What about Baltar? What about Kara? What about? It's great, and it's surprising, and I think it's a sledgehammer blow at the end when Adama is shot. You just don't see it coming. You just don't suspect that anything like that is lying in wait for you, the viewer. And that's what makes it work. So, this will be the final podcast of the first season. Thank you all for listening. And I hope if I get a chance to do more of these podcasts, perhaps as we go into production, I might leave you a few more of these along the way. And otherwise, I will be sure to be talking to you again this summer when Season 2 of Battlestar Galactica begins. And we will begin moments after all of this ends. So thank you, and good night.